Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Stuka Pilot, part 16. A wireless signal on April the 19th summons me once again to the Reichskanzlei. To reach Berlin from Czechoslovakia in an unescorted aircraft is at this time no longer a simple matter. At more than one place, the Russian and the American fronts are very close to one another. The airspace is alive with aircraft, but none of them are German. I arrive at the Reichskanzlei and am admitted to the anteroom of the Führer's bunker. There is an atmosphere of calm and confidence. Those present are mainly army officers taking part in present or contemplated operations. From outside, one can hear the thump of the 2,000-pounders which mosquitoes are dropping in the center of the city. It is nearly 11 p.m. when I stand in the presence of the Supreme Commander. I have foreseen the object of his interview. The definite acceptance of the assignment previously discussed. It is an idiosyncrasy of the Führer to beat about the bush and never to come directly to the point. So, on this evening he begins with a half-hour lecture explaining the decisiveness in the course of the centuries of technical developments in which we have always led the field, an advantage which we must also now exploit to the limit and so positively turn the tide of victory in our favor. He tells me that the whole world is afraid of German science and technology and shows me some intelligence reports which indicate the steps the Allies are already taking to rob us of our technical achievements and our scientists. Every time I listen to him, I am astounded at his memory for figures and his specialized knowledge of all things technical. At this time I have about 6,000 flying hours behind me, and with my extensive practical experience there is very little I do not know about the various types of aircraft he refers to, but there is nothing on which he cannot expatiate with an incomparable ease and on which he does not make apt suggestion for modifications. His physical condition is not as good as it was perhaps 3 or 4 months ago. There is a perceptible glitter in his eyes. Wing Commander Belo tells me that for the last 8 weeks Hitler has had virtually no sleep, one conference after another. His hand trembles. This dates from the attempt on his life of the July the 20th plot. During the long discussion that evening, I notice moreover that he is apt to repeat certain trains of thought which he never used to, though his words are clearly thought out and full of determination. When the long preamble is finished, the Führer comes to the main theme I have listened to so often. He recapitulates the reasons communicated to me a few days ago and concludes, "It is my wish that this hard task should be undertaken by you, the only man who wears the highest German decoration for bravery." With the same and similar arguments as on the last occasion, I once again refuse, especially as the situation at the front has still further deteriorated, and I emphasized that it is only a matter of time before the East and West fronts will meet in the middle of the Reich, and when that happens, 2 pockets will have to operate separately. Only the northern pocket would then come under consideration for the execution of his plan, and it would be necessary to concentrate all our jet aircraft inside it. It interests me that the number of serviceable jet aircraft, including bombers and fighters, on the returns for the day is given as 180. At the front we have long felt that the enemy has a numerical superiority of almost 20 to 1. Seeing that the jet aircraft require particularly large airfields, it is obvious to start with that only a limited number of airfields within the northern pocket come into question. I point out that as soon as we have assembled our aircraft at these bases, they will be pounded day and night by enemy bombers, and from a merely technical aspect, their operational effectiveness will be nil in a couple of days, in which case it will no longer be possible to keep the airspace above General Wenck's army free of the enemy, and the catastrophe will then be inevitable because the army will be strategically immobilized. I know from my personal contact with General Wenck that the army includes my guarantee of a free airspace as a reliable factor in all its calculations, as we have so often done successfully together in Russia. This time I cannot take upon myself the responsibility, and I stick to my refusal. and once again I discovered that anyone of whom Hitler has reason to believe that he only desires to serve the best interests of the whole is free to express his opinion, and that he is willing to revise his own ideas, while understandably he has ceased to have any confidence in people who have repeatedly deceived and disappointed him. He declines to accept my two-pocket theory as an accurate prediction. He bases his opinion on a firm and unqualified promise given to him by the respective army commanders of each sector that they will not retreat from the present fronts, which are, broadly speaking, the line of the Elbe in the west, and in the east the line of the Oder, the Neiße and the Sudeten mountains. I remark that I trust the German soldier to acquit himself with especial gallantry now that he is fighting on German soil, but that if the Russians mass their forces for a concentrated blow at one key point, they are bound to batter a gap in our defenses, and then the two fronts will link up. I quote instances from the Eastern Front in recent years, when the Russians hurled tank after tank into the battle, and the three armored divisions failed to reach their objective. They simply threw in 10, gaining ground on our depleted Russian front at the cost of enormous losses in men and material. Nothing could have stopped them. The question then was whether or not they would exhaust this immense reserve of manpower before Germany was beaten to her knees. They did not, because the help they received from the West was too great. From a purely military standpoint, every time we gave ground at that time in Russia and the Soviets suffered heavier losses in men and material, it was a victory for the defense. Even though the enemy ridiculed these victories, we know that it was so. But this time, a victorious retirement was useless, for then the Russians would be only a few miles behind the Western Front. The Western powers have accepted a grave responsibility, perhaps for centuries to come, by weakening Germany only to give additional strength to Russia. At the end of our talk, I say to the Führer these words: "In my opinion, at this moment, the war can no longer be ended victoriously on both fronts, but it is possible on one front if we can succeed in getting an armistice with the other." A rather tired smile flits across his face as he replies: "It is easy for you to talk. Ever since 1943 I have tried incessantly to conclude a peace, but the Allies won't. From the outset they have demanded unconditional surrender. My personal fate is naturally of no consequence, but every man in his right mind must see that I could not accept unconditional surrender for the German people. Even now negotiations are pending, but I have given up all hope of their success. Therefore, we must do everything to surmount this crisis, so that decisive weapons may yet bring us victory." After some further talk about the position of Schörner's army, he tells me that he intends to wait a few days to see whether the general situation develops as he anticipates or my fears are justified. In the first case, he will recall me to Berlin for a final acceptance of the assignment. It is nearly 1 o'clock in the morning when I leave the Führer's bunker. The first visitors are waiting in the ante-room to offer their congratulations on his birthday. I return to Kummer early, flying low to avoid the American Mustangs, 4-engine bombers and Thunderbolts, which soon infest the upper air and are above me almost all the way back. Having to fly like this alone below these enemies and constantly on the qui-vive, have they spotted you or not, is a greater strain than many an operational flight. If Niermann and I occasionally get rather hot under the collar with the suspense, it is not to be wondered at. We are glad to set foot again on our home base. The slight relaxation of the pressure exerted by the Russians west of Görlitz is partly due to our daily operations, which have inflicted heavy losses. One evening after the last sortie of the day, I drive into Görlitz, my hometown, now in the battle zone. Here I meet many acquaintances of my youth. They are all in some job or other, not the least of their activities being their home defense duties with the Volkssturm. It is a strange reunion. We are shy of uttering the thoughts that fill our minds. Each has his load of trouble, sorrow and bereavement, but at this moment our eyes are focused only on the danger from the east. Women are doing men's work, digging tank traps, and only lay down their spades for a brief pause to suckle their hungry babies. Greybeards forget the infirmities of age and labor till their brows are damp with sweat. Grim resolution is written on the faces of the girls. They know what is in store for them if the red hordes break through. a people in a struggle for survival. If the nations of the West could see with their own eyes the happenings of these days, pregnant with destiny, and realize their significance, they would very soon abandon their frivolous attitude towards Bolshevism. Only the 2nd Squadron is billeted in Kummer. The wing staff has its headquarters in the schoolhouse at Nimes. Some of us live in the homes of the local inhabitants who are 95% German and do everything possible to meet our every wish. The business of getting to and from the airfield is not altogether plain sailing. One man always squats on the mudguard of every car as a lookout for enemy aircraft. American and Russian low-flying planes scour the country at every minute of the day, actually crisscrossing one another in this region. The more unpleasant visitors come from the west, the others from the east. When we take off on a sortie, we often find the Amis lying in wait for us in one direction and the Ruskis in another. Our old Ju-87 crawls like a snail in comparison with the enemy aircraft, and when we approach the objective of our mission, the constant aerial combat strains our nerves to snapping point. If we attack, the air is instantly alive with swarming foes. If we are on our homeward course, we have again to force a passage through a ring of hostile aircraft before we can land. Our flak on the airfield usually has to shoot us a free path. American fighters do not attack us if they see that we are headed for the front and already engaged in aerial combat with the Ivans. We generally take off from the Kummer airfield in the morning with 4 or 5 anti-tank aircraft, accompanied by 12 to 14 FW-190s carrying bombs and at the same time acting as our escort. The enemy then waits for our appearance in overwhelming superiority. Rarely, if we have sufficient petrol, we are able to carry out a combined operation with all the formations attached to my command, and then the enemy in the air outnumbers us by only 5 to 1. Yes, indeed, our daily bread is earned with sweat and tears. On April the 25th, another wireless signal from the Führer's headquarters reaches me, completely jumbled. Practically nothing is intelligible, but I assume I am again being summoned to Berlin. I ring up the Air Command and report that I have been presumably ordered to Berlin and request permission to fly there. The Commodore refuses. According to the Army Bulletin, fighting is going on around Tempelhof Aerodrome and he does not know if there is any airfield free of the enemy. He says, "If you come down in the Russian lines, they will chop my head off for having allowed you to start." He says he will try to contact Wing Commander von Below immediately by wireless to ask for the correct text of the message and where I can land if at all. For some days I hear nothing. Then at 11 p.m. on April the 27th, he rings me up to inform me that he has at last made contact with Berlin and that I am to fly there tonight in a AG-111 and land on the wide east to west arterial road through Berlin at the point where the Brandenburg Gate and the Victory Monument stand. Niermann will accompany me. The takeoff with the AG-111 at night is not altogether easy, as our airfield has neither flares round the perimeter nor any other lighting. It is, besides, small and has good-sized hills on one side of it. In order to be able to take off at all, we have to partly empty the petrol tank so as to reduce the weight of the aircraft. Naturally, this cuts the time we can stay in the air, a serious handicap. We make a start at 1 a.m., a pitch-dark night. We fly over the Sudeten Mountains into the battle zone on a north-northwesterly course. The country below us is illuminated eerily by fires. Many villages and towns are burning. Germany is in flames. We realize our helplessness to prevent it, but one must not think about it. On the outskirts of Berlin, the Soviet searchlights and flag already reach up at us. It is almost impossible to make out the plan of the city, as it is enveloped in thick smoke and a dense pall of vapor hangs above it. In some places, the incandescence of the fires is so blinding that one cannot pick out the landmarks on the ground, and I just have to stare into the darkness for a while before I can see again, but even so, I cannot recognize the east-to-west arterial road. One conflagration next to another, the flash of guns a nightmare spectacle. My radio operator has made contact with the ground. Our first instructions are to wait. That puts the lid on it, especially as we have only so much petrol. After about 15 minutes, a message comes through from Wing Commander von Below that a landing is impossible as the road is under heavy shell fire and the Soviets have already captured the Potsdamer Platz. My instructions are to fly on to Rechlin and to telephone to Berlin from there for further orders. My radio operator has the wavelength of this station. We fly on and call Rechlin not a minute too soon, for our petrol tank is nearly empty. Below us, a sea of flame, which can only mean that even on the other side of Berlin, the Reds have broken through in the Neuruppin area, and at the best, only a narrow escape corridor to the west can still be free. On my request for landing lights, the Rechlin airfield refuses. They are afraid of instantly attracting a night attack from enemy aircraft. I read them in clear the text of my instructions to land there, adding a few not exactly polite remarks. It is gradually becoming uncomfortable because our petrol may give out at any moment. Suddenly below us to port, a niggardly show of lights outlines an airfield. We land. Where are we? At Wittstock, 19 miles from Rechlin. Wittstock has listened in to our conversation with Rechlin and decided to show its airfield. An hour later, getting on for 3 a.m., I arrive at Rechlin, where the VHF is in the Commodore's room. With it, I am able to get in touch with Berlin by telephone. Wing Commander von Below tells me that I am not now to come into Berlin as, unlike me, Field Marshal Greim has been reached in time by wireless and has taken over my assignment. Moreover, he says, it is momentarily impossible to make a landing in Berlin. I reply, I suggest that I should land this morning by daylight on the east-west arterial road with a Stuka. I think it can still be done if I use a Stuka. Besides, it is essential to get the government out of this danger point so that they do not lose touch with the situation as a whole. Von Below asks me to hold the line while he goes to make inquiries. He comes back to the telephone and says, the Führer has made up his mind. He is absolutely decided to hold Berlin and cannot therefore leave the capital where the situation looks critical. He argues that if he left himself, the troops which are fighting to hold it would say that he was abandoning Berlin and would draw the conclusion that all resistance was useless. Therefore, the Führer intends to stay in the city. You are no longer to come in, but are to fly back immediately to the Sudetenland to lend the support of your formations to Field Marshal Schörner's army, which is also to launch a thrust in the direction of Berlin. I ask von Below what the feeling is about the situation, because he tells me all this so calmly and matter-of-factly. Our position is not good, but it must be possible for a thrust by General Wenck or Schörner to relieve Berlin. I admire his calmness. To me, everything is clear, and I fly back to my unit forthwith to carry on operations. The shock of the news that the head of state and supreme commander of the armed forces of the Reich is dead has a stunning effect upon the troops. But the Red Hordes are devastating our country, and therefore we must fight on. We shall only lay down our arms when our leaders give the order. This is our plain duty according to our military oath. It is our plain duty in view of the terrible fate which threatens us if we surrender unconditionally as the enemy insists. It is our plain duty also to the destiny which has placed us geographically in the heart of Europe and which we have obeyed for centuries. But we are to be the bulwark of Europe against the East. Whether or not Europe understands or likes this role which fate has thrust upon us, or whether her attitude is one of fatal indifference or even of hostility, does not alter by one iota our European duty. We are determined to be able to hold our heads high when the history of our continent, and particularly of the dangerous times ahead, is written. The east and west fronts are edging closer and closer to each other. Our operations are of increasing difficulty. The discipline of my men is admirable, not different from on the first day of the war. I am proud of them, very proud. The severest punishment for my officers is, as it has always been, not to be allowed to fly with the rest on operations. I myself have some trouble with my stump. My mechanics have constructed for me an ingenious contrivance like a devil's hoof, and with it I fly. It is attached below the knee joint, and with every pressure upon it, that is to say, when I have to kick the right rudder bar, the skin at the bottom of the stump, which was doing its best to heal, is rubbed sore. The wound is reopened again with violent bleeding. Especially in aerial combat, when I have to bank extremely to the right, I am hampered by the wound, and sometimes my mechanic has to wipe the blood-spattered engine parts clean. I am very lucky again in the first day of May. I have an appointment with Field Marshal Schörner in his Air Command HQ in a castle at Hermannstädtel, about 50 miles east of us. I fly there in a Fieseler Storch and see that the castle is surrounded by tall trees. There is a park in the middle of which I think I can land. My faithful Fridolin is behind me in the plane. The landing comes off all right. After a short stay to pick up some maps, we take off again towards the tall trees on a gentle rise. The Storch is slow in gathering speed. To help her start, I lower the flaps a short distance before the edge of the forest. But this only brings me just below the tops of the trees. I give the stick a pull, but we have not sufficient impetus. To pull any more is useless. The aircraft becomes nose-heavy. I already hear a crash and clatter. Now I have finally smashed my stump, if nothing worse. Then everything is quiet as a mouse. Am I down on the ground? No, I am sitting in my cockpit, and there too is Fridolin. We are jammed in a forking branch at the top of a lofty tree, merrily rocking to and fro. The whole tree sways back and forth with us several times. Our impact was evidently a bit too violent. I am afraid the Storch will now play us another trick and finish by tipping the cockpit over backwards. Fridolin has come forward and asks in some alarm, "What's happening?" I call out to him, "Don't budge, or else you will topple what remains of the Storch off the tree into a 30-foot drop." The tail is broken off, as well as large pieces of the wing planes. They are all lying on the ground. I still have the stick in my hand. My stump is uninjured. I have not knocked it against anything. One must have luck on one side. Again. We cannot get down from the tree. It is very high and has a thick, smooth trunk. We wait, and after a time the general arrives on the scene. He has heard the crash and now sees us perched up aloft in the tree. He is mightily glad we got off so lightly. As there is no other possible way of getting us down, he sends for the local fire brigade. They help us down with a long extending ladder. The Russians have bypassed Dresden and are trying to cross the Erzgebirge from the north so as to reach the Protectorate and thus outflank Field Marshal Schörner's army. The main Soviet forces are in the Freiberg area and southeast of it. On one of our last sorties, we see south of Diepoldeswalde a long column of refugees with Soviet tanks going through it like steamrollers, crushing everything under them. We immediately attack the tanks and destroy them. The column continues its trek towards the south. Apparently, the refugees hope to get behind the protecting screen of the Sudeten Mountains, where they think they will be safe. In the same area, we attack some more enemy tanks in a veritable tornado of flak. I have just fired at a Stalin tank and am climbing to 600 feet when, looking around, I notice a drizzle of bits and pieces behind me. They are falling from above. I ask, "Niermann, which of us has just been shot down?" That seems to me the only explanation, and Niermann thinks the same. He hurriedly counts our aircraft, but all of them are there, so none of them was shot down. I look down at my Stalin and see only a black spot. Could the explanation be that the tank exploded and the explosion flung up its wreckage to this height? After the operation, the crews which were flying behind me confirm that this tank blew up with a terrific explosion into the air behind me. The bits and pieces which I saw raining down from above were from the tank. Presumably, it was packed with high explosive, and its mission was to clear tank barriers and other obstacles out of the way of the other tanks. I do not envy Niermann on these operations. For now, flying is certainly no life insurance. If I am forced to land anywhere, there is no longer any chance of making an escape. He flies with an incomparable placidity. His nerves amaze me. A shorter episode today because the next episode will be the final one plus the epilogue, and I want these to be on their own. But thankfully there's quite a lot happening in this episode despite its shorter runtime. For one, Rudel meets with the old man again and discusses the general situation and even tells the Führer to his face that the war cannot be won anymore. And the Führer actually explains that he has been trying to get a diplomatic solution going for years, but the Allies wouldn't budge. Now, whether this is true is contentious, but either way, they meet just 3 days before the old man checked out inside his bunker. He doesn't talk about it in details, but I'm sure that this was quite a memorable occurrence for Rudel. The same goes for him crashing again, yet miraculously not suffering any injuries. Now, the war will be over in a couple of days, and we will learn how Hans-Ulrich deals with this in the next episode. Cheers and bye-bye.